Welcome back to the RBR Recap, episode 10, a momentous event. We made it to 10. I'm Alex Burgos, joined as always by my co-host, Gabe Rivas. Gabe, how are you, sir, on this fine Sunday, March 27th?
I'm happy. I'm home. I was in Florida for 2 weeks. I'm just happy to see this nice lemon tree behind me once again for this podcast.
Yeah, man, you threw everyone off last week with that background. I love to see the lemons in the background as well. We had a busy weekend. A lot of good fights. We knew on paper that, things were going to be interesting because there were championship fights, there were potential building block fights, and we got to see the debut in the U.S. of Tszyu. So let's jump right into it, starting actually with what was on DAZN earlier in the day between Kiko Martinez and Josh Warrington. That was a rematch. Martinez coming in defending his IBF title, a title that Warrington owned not too long ago before he lost it to Mauricio Lara. And so it was in Leeds in the UK in Warrington's backyard. And what ended up happening, a lot of people probably were predicting a Warrington victory. He was a slight betting favorite. And we wanted to see maybe what Martinez had left in the tank. Now, he did beat Kid Galahad for the title in his last fight, but it was kind of like he was able to land one big punch that kind of took Galahad out. So it was kind of make or break for both of these guys. If one of them lost or if one of them was really, dominated, you expected people to start talking about retirement and things like that. And so what happened was right out of the gate, Josh Warrington came full steam ahead and really bum rushed Kiko Martinez. Now the referee let him do a little bit too much with the shoulder bumping and the headbutts, but he really steamrolled him, dropped Martinez in the first round, and then ended up stopping him in the seventh in front of the sold out crowd at the First Direct Arena in Leeds. And so, Gabe, starting with this fight, what are your thoughts on not only Warrington's performance and his victory, but the fact that he did suffer a broken jaw? And so now kind of the outlook of what's potentially next might change a little bit. Does he go maybe a soft touch or into one of these more difficult fights or a unification?
What you saw from Josh Warrington is what you want to see a fighter do throughout his career, and that's get better. 5 years ago, his fight against Martinez ended by majority decision. This one, it was a much more dominant victory against Kiko Martinez, and that's what you want to see. He learned from his first fight, and after these 5 years, what if I were Kiko Martinez, what I would have done is it avoided the shootout at the beginning of the fight. Now, there are different ways to do it. You could have tied him up. You could have used your legs. The consensus is that when you're a shorter fighter, you have to go forward and, work the body and do all that. But I think with this Warrington fight, he would have been there at all times. He didn't really have to chase him, and he wasn't going to. So I think in the earlier rounds, maybe you should have avoided the shootout by tying him up, maybe using your legs a little bit, because what happened is that he continued engaging with him, and he got dropped with the right hand. And I'm sure that he was not able to recover from that. And that was a big factor in that fight. Coming in there, bum rushing him, essentially hurting him. And then Kiko Martinez was just not in the fight or not able to recover from that knockdown from then on. So Warrington looked great. He did suffer a broken jaw, so that's going to affect the way that he returns. If I'm his manager or his promoter, I'm thinking we do need a soft touch before he gets back because we want to see him recover from that shot. But aside from that, there are very interesting matchups that could be made at 126 pounds, which just keeps getting more interesting as the weeks progress. Mark Magsayo upset Gary Russell Jr. a few weeks back. That's a potential unification fight. Also, Emmanuel Navarrete, you can put him against a heavy bag, and it's going to be an exciting fight. But that's with different promoters, different television platforms. At home, there's an interesting fight that he can be in, and that's against Lee Wood, who has a WBA 126-pound championship. So if that fight can be made in the near future, that'd be great. And then finally, Mauricio Lara, in his post-fight interview with Emilio Sanchez, he told me that he has some unfinished business with Josh Warrington. He even hoped that he would win this fight so that he can fight him. And in his own words, he says, I'm going to retire him from the sport. So there's a lot of bad blood in this fight. There's a lot of history, and it'd be really, I think, really good for the sport, really good for the 126-pound division to see Mauricio Lara versus Josh Warrington just to finally settle the score.
Yeah, definitely. You mentioned a lot of big names, ones that we've mentioned in previous episodes. After Gary Russell Jr. lost his title to Magsayo, when Lara won, Navarrete is definitely a name that's out there and was even mentioned in the DAZN, post-fight interview. It's kind of like a guy you can't avoid, even though it's a cross promotional thing like you're mentioning. I feel like they gave credence to him, to Mark Magsayo as potential opponents in the future for Josh Warrington. And being honest, I don't think Warrington wants any part of Lara. There's that unfinished business type thing, but I think that applies more to Lara. And, from Eddie Hearn's perspective, if it's me, and if it's, what I saw last night, I see that Josh Warrington can pack a house in Leeds. He can, have these raucous, successful nights of boxing. Against Kiko Martinez, that's one thing, but bringing in a Mauricio Lara, even into hostile territory, I feel like he'd feed into it and be like, yeah, I want to brawl. I want to go head to head in the first round. And that just cuts the longevity of Josh Warrington's career. And I was a little bit surprised that, Lee Wood was interviewed. Now, he gave Warrington his time. He's like, look, this is his night. He won the title. Let him have his moment. But, from Warrington's perspective, too, he was kind of like, we'll see. I feel like that's the fight, domestically, if you're thinking like a promoter. And just from a fan's perspective, too, that's a good fight. Now, I know a lot of people are, even on our Instagram and Twitter pages, they're complaining like, why did Warrington get this opportunity? Why isn't it Lara that stepped up and got the opportunity versus Martinez? Valid points. But, if we're made to settle for another fight, I wouldn't mind seeing Josh Warrington versus Lee Wood. Both have, a good power. Both are exciting and both can bring in a crowd, and it would be a fun fight to watch. If I had to choose, if we get that fight, just shifting kind of to Mauricio Lara, because I don't want to leave him out of the conversation. I mean, Emmanuel Navarrete is just that fight would be super exciting, and I would love to see that. So I don't know. Let me ask you real quick: if you had one fight that you could make for Josh Warrington, heel, jaw, and everything, after that, what's the fight that you make?
That's a difficult question because I always want to see unification fights. Sometimes even before those fights where there's bad blood and they're ending a long period of back and forth, like with Lara. Lara is perhaps one of the most exciting fights there. But if I had to pick, I'm always going to pick unification fights because it adds to more clarity in the division. You know who the champion is. So perhaps Lee Wood, because of all those elements, you keep it in-house. You fight against the fighter with the same promoter. It's going to be a packed crowd, a huge environment in the UK. And you get some clarity about who the winner, who the champion is once those belts are unified. That'd be the WBA and the IBF title. And then after that, you have more leverage to get some of those other fights. You can say, look, Mark, you want to be undisputed at this division, you have to fight me. Same thing with Emmanuel Navarrete. And again, I'll say it again, Navarrete against a heavy bag is an exciting fight. Put him against anybody, and he's going to give him a lot of trouble at 126 pounds. And I think the majority of people would agree that he's the best fighter at 126 right now. He just has to show it.
Yeah, and props to you because that's consistent. You've kind of talked about that throughout the time that we've spent doing this podcast. Clarity, champions fighting champions, and it's definitely something I agree with, something that you want to see. Exactly.
Yeah, it's good for the sport. I mean, one of the benefits that UFC has over us is that they have their own ranking systems and they have one belt per each division. Maybe an interim champ when someone gets injured, but there's clarity. I can tell people from other sports who's the best fighter at a given division is.
So it remains to be seen. We'll see how Warrington heals up, but big victory for him once again. Now he's two-time IBF champion. Also on Saturday, we had a Premier Boxing Champions fight card on Showtime. It was headlined by the U.S. debut of Tszyu versus former U.S. Olympian Terrell Gauss, who was coming off of an early TKO victory over Jamonte Clark. This was a big test, a big step up for Tszyu, not only making his U.S. debut, but fighting a guy the caliber of Gauss. And once again, similar with the Edgar Berlanga fight, where Berlanga's like, I'm coming in looking for a knockout. I'm not, being shy about that. Tszyu said similar things. Again, Gauss, even more so than Steve Rolls was for Berlanga, Gauss was live. He was a live dog and he asked questions of Tszyu and he ended up knocking him down in the first round. And maybe in hindsight, we'll see later on down the road in hindsight, we'll say, you know what, that's what Tszyu needed. But, the hype was definitely really big and the pressure was on Tszyu. Obviously, his dad, Tszyu, being a Hall of Famer, there's already enough pressure with that. But he's been kind of, wiping everyone out in Australia, and he's kind of like this next big star for them. So it was an interesting beginning to the fight, and over time, he really got his bearings, got his feet under him, and ended up winning a unanimous decision by scores of 116-111, 115-112, and 114-113. Now, that 114-113 card's a little suspect, I think. There are some things that when you watch him, though, you're kind of like, how has he gotten away with this for so long? And Tszyu stands straight up and down, really not interested, at least last night, in any head movement or, defense. And, it cost him a little bit with the counter right hand from Gauss in the first round. And now you start thinking maybe a bigger puncher can take advantage of those things. And so it was all in all a successful debut for him. And now we get to see what's next. He says he's going to be at that Charlo versus Castaño rematch. Obviously, he wants the big names now. He's 27 years old. Gabe, I want to kick it to you to ask you, what were your impressions, your thoughts of Tszyu's performance against Gauss?
Anytime you're making a debut in the United States, there are a lot of variables that are going to influence your performance. It's a new crowd, new television platform, a lot of pressure. Like you mentioned, he has the added element of being the son of a Hall of Famer in Tszyu. All those things have to be taken into consideration when it comes to this performance. He got dropped in the first round. That's definitely something that you do not want to see when you're making a coming out party in the United States. But like you said, this might be in the future something where we look back and say, this is what he needed in order to develop and become a better fighter. But also, I think he should watch some tape on his father, Tszyu, and learn from his mistakes. Don't make the same mistakes. Don't be a target that is just very set. And he needs to be more of a moving target. He needs to move his head more. So I think one of the things he needs to work on right now is to use more head movement, to use more defense. And that will really allow him to make the most of his abilities. He's strong. He's talented. He has the genes to become a big star and a big champion, but he needs to learn from the mistakes from this fight and from the mistakes by watching tape of his own father and seeing how perhaps he had a little bit of setbacks in his career because he wasn't taking care of that defense and he wasn't a moving target.
Watching his style, he's an athletic guy. He can put more attention to defense. He could do different things in there. And maybe because he hasn't faced adversity in the past, we haven't been able to see what he can do defensively. Now, he has been knocked down once before, but it was just, a different level of attention on him in this fight with the PBC main event on Showtime. I think we do need to pump the brakes a little bit in terms of everyone talking about, he's, being avoided and he's, this killer and, the champions aren't going to want to fight him. Like, you can obviously see there's some holes and gaps in his game that other people could probably take advantage of. I don't think he's ready immediately for that winner of Charlo Castaño 2. We do have another exciting fight in that division coming up in a week or two in Erickson Lubin versus Sebastian Fundora. So, maybe that level of opposition, which is no cakewalk either, no walk in the park, but maybe that's his next step. See who wins that fight, and then maybe the winner of that, because Lubin has put in the work. Yes, he did get blasted early on and knocked out by Jermell Charlo, but he's really put in the work and really built himself back up. Also beat Terrell Gauss. Now, if he can, get over Sebastian Fundora, then that's really a fight that I like. Obviously, they'll probably want to petition for the winner of the Castaño, Charlo rematch, but a lot of, names in and around that division. One question mark is, also Jarrett Hurd, where's he been if he comes back? One name that you can kind of throw in there as well. But I thought all in all, a good debut for Tszyu. I know you mentioned his style, learning from his dad. I think one of the trainers is his father's trainer. So it's kind of like, you see that similarity. Not only does he look like a young Tszyu, I mean, he fights like him. Hopefully they can kind of pick up on those nuances and go back and look at some tape and be like, what, we need to work on this stuff. And maybe spending more time in the U.S. and getting some looks from other trainers. He was, at the Mayweather gym this whole time, maybe getting looks from other fighters, styles that you would see in the States. It could maybe get him acclimated for some of these fights and fighters and styles that he's going to see in the future.
Right. And one thing for our listeners and watchers, subscribers, is to watch Tszyu versus Vince Phillips, 1997. It was Tszyu's first loss, and it ended by a technical knockout. So might be worthwhile for him and our listeners and subscribers to check that fight out and see what his son, Tim, can learn from that experience.
Definitely. Yeah, I think a lot of people just, when you think of Tszyu, you think of that Zab Judah knockout,
right? Yeah.
Which is awesome too. Watch that one if you haven't. But yeah, the Vince Phillips fight is a great one to watch. So definitely check that out. Also on Saturday night, we had a Top Rank on ESPN card, the return of Miguel Berchelt taking on Jeremiah Nakathila. Now, a lot of people know Nakathila from getting beat in a one-sided fight against Shakur Stevenson. Of course, that was the fight that everyone was complaining, Tim Bradley and everyone else, about how Stevenson didn't pull the trigger. Y'all might have to come back and give my man Shakur Stevenson an apology, because Jeremiah Nakathila, just like Berchelt for this fight, was moving up in weight. And I mean, he completely dominated the fight. The fight was stopped after the 6th round by the referee. At the time of stoppage, Nakathila was up 60-53 on every card. It was just really impressive by Nakathila, seeing how he was able to walk down and really impose his will. And at the end of the day, stop Berchelt. He hit him with some big punches throughout the fight. And we know that Berchelt's game plan going into this fight was a lot different than what he had done historically. You know, you could tell he wanted to move around, box, and not just sit in there and bang. But it looked awkward, in all honesty. It didn't look like it was natural to him. And, you know, I think Andre Ward mentioned as well, it's like when you go into a career or when you start boxing and you use maybe just one style that's just going in and imposing your will and knocking everyone out, that works against you later on, because when you suffer a devastating knockout like Berchelt did against Valdez, then you go back to the drawing board and you say, well, what can I do to go back to the basics? But you could kind of see that Berchelt never really had the basics in his bag. And maybe those things just weren't cultivated in his camp. Berchelt had a new trainer in this fight in Jorge Capetillo, and no knock against him, but it's just like you can't teach a guy something that he's put to the side for so long in one camp. His debut at this weight class at 135 was supposed to be kind of like a coming out party for him and show what he could do. But boxing is a cruel sport. And I think, you know, now only one fight removed from being, you know, a champion from the Valdez fight, he comes into this fight and just, that might be all she wrote. Gabe, I want to get your opinion on not only Nakathila's big victory, but also Miguel Berchelt, and maybe have we seen the last of him?
A few things, because the first thing is that you threw me off a little bit because I had forgotten about that. It was against Nakathila where everyone was complaining that Shakur Stevenson was in a boring fight. Now, either he did his homework prior and prepared adequately, or he went in the ring and felt some of those punches and said, you know what, I'm going to be smart and box this whole fight and cruise to a decision. That's what Shakur Stevenson did. And now it looks like he was a genius for having done that. And you got to respect his performance. If he's a boxer, play to your strengths, stay on the outside, box him, especially if he's a hard puncher. Now we saw that he is a hard puncher against someone like Berchelt by stopping him by technical knockout the way that he did. So props to Shakur Stevenson. I saw a quote from him yesterday talking about why he received less money for fighting Oscar Valdez. And he said, when you bet on yourself, you always win. And again, this kid has a lot of wisdom. So shout out to Shakur Stevenson for having the foresight to fight intelligently against a guy who would eventually now be a player at lightweight. So, and then with regard to Miguel Berchelt, this was a coming out party at 135 pounds. He was moving up following a tough loss to Oscar Valdez in which he was knocked out. And what you want to do in those fights is fight someone tough, but perhaps from the same division as well by having him move up, because he was moving up as well to lightweight. And, you know, perhaps there's not that much of a threat in terms of power because they're moving up and it's something manageable, right? But that wasn't the case in this fight. We saw Berchelt trying to use head movement, trying to move it around. But as you mentioned, if you haven't done that throughout your whole career and you're starting to do it now, it's going to look awkward. You're going to have trouble doing that thing. And so we saw him getting caught very early with right hands. And it was one right hand that threw his mouth guard out. And then it was eventually that continued punishment that forced, I forgot if it was the referee or the corner to stop the fight. And so there's also other elements in his in the press conference. He had said that he wanted to see how he would feel following the after effects from COVID. And that was one factor going into the fight against Oscar Valdez. How much is his performance affected by having dealt with COVID? How much of his performance is affected by having lost in such a devastating fashion against Oscar Valdez? And how much of is it moving up to another weight class where his size and his strength isn't as imposing? So we're going to have to see that moving forward. We obviously wish him the best. And he's still an exciting fighter to see, but it doesn't look that good when you have 2 knockout losses. And with Nakathila, I mean, the world is his oyster right now after scoring such an important victory. Now he can really go back to the lightweight division and say, look, I want to start fighting these bigger names. I have the power to really be a threat against any of them. And I don't think it's enough to say that I lost by decision to Shakur Stevenson, because everyone at his division is going to lose to Stevenson by decision. So he's in a good spot right now.
Right. Props to Nakathila. As far as Berchelt is concerned, I wouldn't mind see him, ride off into the sunset, call it a day. He's given us some exciting fights, some wars, and he had a nice string of title defenses. Obviously, the warrior in him, he wanted to continue. He didn't quit. He didn't stop the fight. But it was definitely in his best interest. The referee was the one that ended up making the call, because I don't know that, his corner does that. They had that same kind of mentality, like, hey, just push through it. You can get one back and maybe change the course of the fight. But I really thought, Russell Moore in particular sometimes gets knocked, and rightfully so, because of bad calls and stuff like that. But he saw the shape that Berchelt was in after that round, and after getting his mouthpiece knocked out, which was, a highlight that went around, social media and stuff like that. But it was a good call. I'm glad that he was saved from his own, ganas, from wanting to go back out and, wanting to go out on his shield. And so, we see enough of that. And then in hindsight, we're like, man, I wish, he would have done this or that, or they would have stopped the fight. So at least we're not talking about it like that, because Nakathila had a quote after the fight. He's like, it's good that they stopped it, because I was going to put him to sleep. I was going to send him somewhere else.
Luckily, he gave up, himself. I was going to hit him bad or put him to sleep in a bad way. Luckily, he see it coming, and then he decided he's not going to come back.
Nakathila was doing what he had to do. And so, like you said, the world is his oyster now. A lot of exciting fights for him. And yeah, it just puts that Shakur Stevenson fight into perspective a little bit more. It puts boxing styles into perspective. And for people that love to say, oh, he's boring, he runs, he's this, he's that. Even I go back to last week with the Berlanga and Rolls fight. When you get a guy that knows what he has to do to win a fight, that's the most difficult fighter. You play to your strengths. You go in there and you do what you have to do to win a fight.
Win today, look good tomorrow. And I think that might be the game plan,
Yes, most definitely. But that's it for us for episode 10 of the RBR Recap. Next week, we'll be back once again. And we thank you for listening.
Thank you for listening to the RBR Recap. Make sure to follow us on social media at RBR Recap. And visit RBRRecap.com for the latest episodes.